Hi, everyone. I hope this finds you in good health and good spirits. This week, we're going to be talking about sequencers. And sequencers is a really big, important topic in sound synthesis in general and in modular synthesis in particular. So we're going to spend the whole week on sequencers. In today's lesson, we'll give a general overview of the modules and talk about some of their general functions. And then in the next lesson, we'll get into sequencers in a little more detail and look at some more advanced functions. So today, we're going to be talking about sequencers. We'll go over their general definition. We'll go through a little bit of sequencer history, look at silver apples of the moon, a really important piece in synthesizer history that relies on sequencers. And then we'll spend the rest of the lesson looking at sequencers in VCV rack. So to start with, a sequencer is a module that produces programmable control voltages in a cycle or sequence, hence their name. With a sequencer, you can set a certain number, let's say 8, control voltages, which can be sent to any module in your rack, but are most often used to send pitch information to an oscillator. So a sequencer is most often used to create a sequence of pitches, which would then be played by your oscillator. Sequencers can repeat these cycles, these sequences, endlessly at a variable rate. So sequencers have a clock built into them that will set the tempo for the sequence, and these sequences will just loop over and over again, and these can loop very quickly or they can play very slowly, and that's up to the user to set the tempo, to set the rate of the sequence. A sequence can have a variable number of steps or stages. That's what you call each place in the sequence. Each individual step would refer to an individual note if you're sending it to an oscillator. So there can be 4 steps in the sequence, 8, 16, as many as 24. I mean, it's possible to have even more than that, but usually multiples of 8 are the most common. Though you can always adjust these. So if a sequencer has a maximum of 8 steps, you could always eliminate steps. So you could have 7 or 6 or 5, etc. And so, as I mentioned, sequencer voltages are most often used to send volts per octave information to an oscillator, but can also be sent to any module. So they could be sent to adjust the cutoff frequency of a filter, sent to an amplifier, a wave shaper, really anything that takes voltage, which is anything in a modular synthesis rack, can take voltage from the sequencer, and those individual steps of control voltage can shape that module over time. So let's go ahead and look at a video. This is the Canadian artist Venetian Snares, whose music we've looked at already in the past. And in this video, you'll see him working with a modular synthesis rack that looks and appears like it's playing on its own, and in fact it is, because it's relying on sequencers. So every bass line, melody line, even the percussion that you hear in this track, in this video, is all driven by different sequencers. So we generally associate the invention of the sequencer with Don Buchla, but really there were rudimentary sequencing devices that were developed by a few other early synthesizer pioneers, including Peter Zinovieff, who was the founder of EMS synthesizers, and Raymond Scott. Raymond Scott is a really interesting figure. We won't have time to go into him in more detail. But he started out as a band leader, a jazz musician, who wrote a lot of the music that was eventually adapted and used in all kinds of Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies cartoons. And then later in his career, he got really into electronic music and started building and designing his own electronic instruments, some of which had these prototypical sequencing devices in them. So I really encourage you guys to check him out and check his music out because it's super interesting. But the first modern sequencer was developed by Don Buchla and was part of the first Buchla synthesizer. It was actually one of the first modules that Buchla developed at all. And the composers that worked with Buchla were really interested in the sequencer because the sequencer eliminated the need to splice multiple pieces of tape together to create electronic melodies. So usually the way that melodies were recorded, remember these composers aren't really working with keyboards or anything, so they would play a pitch with an oscillator, record that to tape, then play another pitch with an oscillator, record that to tape, and do that over and over again. And if they wanted to rearrange these notes into a different melody, they would have to actually literally cut the tape and splice it, and it was a very labor-intensive and time-consuming process. But Bookless Synthesizer eliminated that need, and so you were able to just program these pitches, and if you wanted to adjust one or change their order, you could do so with literally the turn of a knob or two. And so composers found this really useful for both composition and performance, because it aided in composition in that they're able to try things out and let things loop on the sequence while they make adjustments, but also they're able to do this in performance as well and let the sequencer drive the piece while they're making adjustments live in performance. We'll talk about that more in just a sec, but first let's look at an example of a sequencer module being used on a Bookless synthesizer. So we mentioned that sequencers were used a lot in performance, especially on Bookless synthesizers. You guys saw that a couple weeks ago with the Suzanne Chani video where she's playing live with her Bookless synth, which is being driven by a sequencer. And in that video, you saw that sequencers allow this automatic performance, this hands-free performance. So the sequencer loops, and that gives the performer the ability to make other adjustments, usually subtle adjustments, to all sorts of things with regard to the sound. So while the sequence is running, the performer can make subtle adjustments to the wave shape or the tuning of the oscillator or the filter's cutoff or resonance or the shape of the envelope or even to some parameters of the sequencer itself. So they might change the voltage on a particular sequencer step so that the sequencer is looping and then all of a sudden one of the notes changes, or maybe a couple of the notes change, or maybe the speed of the sequencer changes. The music is able to speed up and slow down. So the sequencer allows all those possibilities. So I mentioned in the outline, we're going to be looking at Silver Apples of the Moon, and this was a really important early synthesizer piece that relied pretty heavily on not just the Buchla synth, but the Buchla synth sequencers in particular. So this piece was recorded on the Buchla 100 music box, and it's historically important for a number of reasons. It was the first full-length album of electronic music. It actually came out the same year, but before Switched on Bach. And it was the first piece of classical music to be commissioned by a record company. It was commissioned by the Elektra Nonsuch label. Usually pieces of classical music were commissioned by certain performers, like orchestras or individual solo performers, or they might be commissioned by a wealthy donor who was associated with an orchestra or something like that. But this was the first time that a record label came along and said, "Hey, Mr. Composer, we want you to write a piece for us." This was composed by Morton Subotnick, who was one of those composers at the San Francisco Tape Music Center who was collaborating with Don Buchla on the development of the Buchla synthesizer. And this piece really takes advantage of the sequencer to create regular rhythmic patterns. It's similar to the Suzanne Chani music we talked about. In this piece, the composer, Subotnick, lets the sequencer drive the music and is making adjustments as it goes. So there's this regular rhythmic sequence, which is driving the piece, but then there's all sorts of subtle changes happening all throughout the music. So the composer is establishing certain patterns, but then in an improvisatory manner develops these patterns and alters these patterns as the music continues. So let's take a listen to a short excerpt, but I've put a longer excerpt on Blackboard for you guys to listen to on your own. So one important part of a sequencer is the clock. And a clock is a module or a circuit that outputs a steady sequence of triggers or gates, but usually triggers, which drive a sequencer forward steadily one step at a time. So basically what the clock does is it's connected to the sequencer, and every time the sequencer gets a trigger from the clock, it hits the next step. It moves to the next step in the sequence. So ideally, and in most cases, you'll have a clock that sends a regular, steady stream of triggers, click, 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 that'll drive that sequencer forward. So sort of how we've used LFOs to create gates in the past. If I wanted to demonstrate how an envelope generator worked in some of the earlier lessons, I've taken a square wave LFO and just sent that to create the gates for my envelope generator. That's basically what these clocks do. Clocks are kind of like the LFO square wave, except they're usually sending triggers, and they'll just send them regularly at a speed that's variable and that the performer can set. And it'll just output this steady stream of clocks, which will drive that sequencer forward. So effectively, clocks are determining the tempo of the sequence. If the clock is moving fast, tick, 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 the sequencer will move quickly. If the clock is moving slowly, tick, 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 then the sequencer will move slowly. Now, some sequencers will have their own clocks built in as part of the module. There'll be a knob or two relating just to the tempo, just to the clock speed. And some sequencers don't have a clock and might need some kind of external clock to drive them. And in those cases, we can use an LFO and send a square wave to them. But as we'll see today, they're actually individual clock modules, which are a little simpler than an LFO and are just designed to send clocks, to send triggers to sequencers or other modules. I know we've been talking a lot about Buchla synthesizers lately, and the sequencer kind of originated on the Buchla, but I'm going to go ahead and play a video of a sequencer being used on an early Moog modular synthesizer. There were sequencers on Moog synthesizers. Moog actually adapted the idea of the sequencer from the Buchla synth, and there was a little bit of give and take between Buchla and Moog. So Moog adapted the sequencer for the Buchla, and then Buchla adapted the filter from the Moog. Remember, Buchla is starting with using wave shapers and things like that, and there wasn't actually a filter on the earliest Buchla synthesizers, but eventually he sees that Moog is working with filters, so he adapts a filter and creates that for the Buchla, and then likewise Moog is adding sequencers to his modular synth. So this video gives a nice overview of how an actual hardware sequencer might work, but also I want you to pay attention to what the guy in the video does with his sequencer. He's not just playing a stream of pitches, but he actually takes one of the gates from the sequencer and connects it to a filter and an envelope generator, so he opens up a filter just on one step of the sequencer. So see if you can notice that and understand what's happening there. And we're going to do that ourselves later in VCB Rack.
Up here you've got a 960 sequential controller, 962 sequential switch, and a 961 interface. I could run this sequencer as 3 separate banks of 8. These are the outputs for each bank, so I could have 8 steps of different voltage controlled outputs for each bank, or I could run them sequentially where I connect them to this module and I could run 8 and then run 16 and then 24 steps, or I can set it up so that this third bank here will actually control the speed that the steps change from one step to another. All right, let's set up some patches. What I'm going to do here is have some fun with the step sequencer, and we're going to create some chaos. I've got the control voltage here going to the oscillator bank 1, and I've got this 6th step right here. Every time it goes through the 6th step, it triggers this envelope generator. This is basically an interfacing thing for transferring a voltage trigger, which is like a 5-volt trigger, into an S trigger. So I've got this 6th step going to the V trigger in, then I've got the S trigger out going to the envelope generator here. The envelope generator is opening and closing the filter based on these parameters here.
Okay, so now let's go ahead and look at a sequencer in VCV Rack. So this is the module you can see here on the slide. It's called Seq3. This is the fundamental sequencer module. And it's a really powerful sequencer module. It's got an internal clock, so we don't need to attach an external clock. If you look at the top left, there's a knob that says clock, and you can use that knob to adjust the speed. It's got a maximum of 8 steps. So if you look in the middle of the module there, you'll see a whole mess of knobs. There's actually 3 rows of 8, and you can see they're numbered across the top there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there are 8 steps maximum, but these can be adjusted. So you could have a maximum of 8, but you could eliminate some of the last steps. If you wanted only 7 steps, you could eliminate the last one. If you wanted only 5 steps, eliminate the last 3, etc. You do that with that steps knob at the top. And it's got 3 rows of variable steps. So it's called the sequencer 3, because it has these 3 different rows. So you can see there the big mess of knobs in the middle. There are 3 rows of 8. And in the top right of the module, you can see row 1, row 2, row 3. There are 3 outputs. One is going to output the voltages from the top row, one will output the voltages from the second row, and one will output the voltages from the third row. And in this layout, it kind of looks like the sequencer we just saw in the MOOG video. The last thing I'll point out here before we actually look at it in rack is that it's got different ways that it outputs gates. So next to those row outputs in the top right, there's a gate output that's going to output a gate with every step of the sequence. And then across the bottom, you'll see a row of 8 outputs, and those are individual outputs for every gate. But now let's go ahead and take a look at how this will work in rack. Okay, so here we are in VCV rack, and I've got an oscillator and my Seek 3 module, and let's get these connected. I'm just going to take the triangle wave out from my oscillator, just droning a steady pitch right now. And now I'm going to take the row 1 output from my sequencer and send that to the volts per octave input on my oscillator. And nothing changes. Right now we're still just getting a steady tone, but that's because all these knobs are set to 0 volts. And as we mouse over them, you see that when it's all the way to the left, it's 0 volts. If it's all the way to the right, it's 10 volts. And using our volts per octave standard here, 10 volts gives us 10 octaves. So this is a 10 octave range that we're moving through with each of these knobs. So even the slightest little movement is going to make a really big difference. Go ahead and give us a few high notes, maybe one here towards the end and one at the very beginning. But let's say we wanted to play a particular melody. Well, for that, we're going to have to know our voltage for our individual pitches, and let's take a look at how to do that. So let's say that we want to program a particular melody into our sequencer. Well, in this case, we would need to know our volts per octave voltages. So if I wanted to program, for instance, Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, we can look at our chart here, if we're in the key of C, and we can use this chart to find the voltages to program in Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. So twinkle, the first 2 notes are the same. They're both 0 volts. That's Do or C. Then the second twinkle is going to be the 5th step of the scale. That's G in the key of C. So we're going to use 0.583 for both of those notes. And then little, we're up to the A. Those are 0.75 for each of those. And then star is going to be back to G. So that's 0.583. Then for the second phrase, How I Wonder What You Are, How I are both on F, 0.417, 0.417. Wonder is on E, 0.333, 0.333. What You is the D, so 0.167, 0.167. And then R, the last note, it doesn't repeat, so we just come down to one last 0 volts there. Let's go ahead and program that into our sequencer. All right, so now I'm going to set these to play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. And so I'm going to type in the voltages. Number 1 is 0, 0. All right, so I've got all those typed in, and now I'm going to unmute. And right now, all of our pitches are kind of connected. They're all kind of blurring together, and we're not really able to differentiate that Twinkle Twinkle melody. So to get that, I'm going to get an envelope generator going. We're going to connect that to an amplifier. And this will help us differentiate each of these pitches, because right now they're all just blurring together. So I'm going to send my triangle wave into that amplifier. And then I'm going to use this envelope generator to shape that amplifier. And then we're going to send the gate output, this main gate output, into our envelope generator. We use blue cables for gates. Let's tweak this a little bit. Okay, so now we can actually start to hear that twinkle twinkle melody. Let's just slow down a little bit. I'm going to use this clock in the top left of the sequencer. Okay, so now this is starting to sound like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, but you notice that we have two notes at the end instead of one long note. So instead of star, we're getting like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star Star. So there's one way we can get rid of that last note, and that's just to turn, using these green buttons at the bottom, turn the gate for the last note off. And so now we're not hearing that last note. The last note repeated, that is. We're still hearing the last pitch. Except now it sounds a little weird because that last note should be twice as long as the other notes. And one way you can kind of fake that is by adding a little bit longer release. So it's taking a while to fade out on this 7th note. It kind of bleeds into that 8th step in the sequence, and we get what sounds like a longer note at the end of our sequence. But it's because it's the release, it's not going to affect the other notes in our sequence there. All right, so let's, instead of Twinkle Twinkle, let's go ahead and just randomize these, and let's get kind of a random sequence, and we're going to see what happens next. On this last note, I'm going to give us a really, really high pitch. And let's leave that last gate off, and let's see how this sounds now. Let's go ahead and make all these pitches relatively low. Now I'm still hearing this high last pitch now, even though this gate is off. And the reason that we hear it now is because it's a different pitch than the 7th step. Before, our 7th and 8th step were the same pitch, so when they didn't change, we didn't really notice. But because it's a new pitch, we can actually hear that even though the gate is off, that just means the sequencer isn't sending a gate to the envelope generator, but it's still changing that pitch on the oscillator. And one way the reason we can see that and still hear that is because the release is up so high. So let's go ahead and add a scope to this so we can actually see what's going on. Let's take a look at our gates coming from our sequencer. So those are our gates. And now let's go ahead and take the output of our envelope generator, and we can look at our envelopes. And you can see that our release is really long. And it's so long that even in that gap where we are missing that gate, we're missing that 8th gate, the release is still up. And so our volume is still up if our release is up, and we're still able to hear that pitch. So one way we can get rid of that pitch is to just bring that release down. Still hear it. It's getting softer. So now our release fades out. It fades down to 0 before that last step in the sequence. And so now we don't hear that high pitch. So that's one thing to be aware of, and that's really important, is to make sure that your releases don't get in the way of the gates that we turn off and on. And we can turn off more than just the last gate, of course. We could even use these to create some interesting rhythms. We could widen the range of these notes, but you notice that we have to be really careful to finesse and keep things in the lower range, otherwise we get these really high pitches. And that's kind of annoying. So what we can do is add an amplifier to this. We're going to take our volts per octave and go into that amplifier before we go to our oscillator. And so now these really high pitches, let's go ahead and make this a little faster. We can actually scale things down. And so now even if we turn our knobs really high, oh, these are off. Let's turn all our gates back on. Even the really high knobs are giving us relatively low pitches still because we're able to scale the overall range with this amplifier. We can widen the range or narrow it. So that's kind of cool, but we're still getting just a bunch of weird pitches. We might even be getting pitches that are kind of in between other pitches. So one way we can work around that is by adding a quantizer. And I'm going to use that JW's module quantizer here. So we're going to stop off in there before we go to our oscillator here. We're going to set our root note. Let's go with F. And set our scale. Let's go with F major. And so now, by the way, you always want to make sure that your amplifier is going before your quantizer. Otherwise, you're going to be scaling the voltage after it comes out the quantizer, and that's going to mess up the whole point of the quantizer. So we want to make sure our amplifier goes before our quantizer. But now as we scale this, we're going to be scaling it, still getting a wider or narrower range, but we're going to be getting all kinds of pitches that are all limited to the F major scale. All right, let's look at some other things on the sequencer that we've not looked at yet. So there's this steps knob, which right now is set all the way up at 8. And this is just going to reduce the number of steps that we have. So right now we're at 8 steps. Let's go ahead and make our first step really high so it's easy to hear. And now I'm going to reduce the number of steps from 8 to 7. Down to 6. We can go all the way down to where there's just 3 steps. 2. Or 1. And so far the sequencer's been running the whole time, but we can actually hit this run button and that turns the sequence off. So the sequence has an on-off button. It's actually more like a play-pause button, because if you notice when I turn it back on, it's not necessarily going to start at our first step. Remember, our first step is that high note. And let's say we want to turn it off, but when we turn it on, we want it to be at the first step. Well, then we can just hit the reset button, and that's going to reset it back to the first step. So now when we start it, and you don't have to have it off to hit the reset. We can hit the reset at any point that it's playing, and it's going to jump back to that first step. So that's kind of handy. So now let's think back to that video we saw where the guy was demonstrating the sequencer on the MOOG modular synth. And remember, he did that cool thing where he had one step of the sequencer opening up a filter. So let's see if we can do that here. So I'm going to make a little room for a filter. We're going to run our oscillator through this filter before it makes its way into the amplifier. We're going to take the triangle wave out so we've got a little more energy to filter. And let's see how that sounds. Okay, so now we want an envelope to open that up. So let's go ahead and copy our envelope generator. We'll stick that one above the filter here. We're going to take the output and use that to modulate our filter's cutoff frequency. So we're going to have to boost our Freq CV in order to hear that change. And so now let's take the first step of our sequence and we're going to send the gate output for just that first step, where this gate sends all the gates for every step. This one's going to send just the first step's gate. And we're going to send that into this envelope generator. And we're going to have a nice long release. Let's go ahead and make our pitches relatively low. So now you can hear every time this first step hits, this filter opens up and starts this long release that takes a while to fade out. It fades out over a few different steps. We slow the clock down a little bit, it might be easier to hear. There we go, that's pretty easy to hear. You can see the little light up here that shows us that we're opening up our filter there. Even make our release a little shorter. Maybe our attack a little longer. And we could move this gate to other steps. So instead of maybe opening on the first step, we might do it on the third step. Or the last step. Let's get some different notes going. All right, so that's how we do that. That's how we can send just the gate from one step to perform some function. We could do all kinds of things with these gates. We could use them to trigger other events, start other oscillators, do all kinds of other things like that. But this is how we can do what was in that video from earlier. Okay, but let's say instead of doing that, I'm going to change the steps on the second row of my sequencer here, and we're going to send row 2 to the filter. So instead of opening the filter just on one step, now we're going to use these voltages here in the second row to change the cutoff frequency of the filter at every step. Let's go ahead and just open some random values here. So now we can hear the filter changing on every step. Let's go ahead and just get all these pitches to be the same pitch so we can focus just on the movement of the filter. So now the first row is controlling the pitch of the oscillator, but it's all sending out the same low pitch. And the second row is changing the cutoff frequency of the filter, and we can hear that movement, so the timbre changes with every step. And we can go ahead and give ourselves some random pitches again. Open our range up a little bit. All right, so now let's look at some other things in the sequencer we haven't looked at yet. We have under the clock a couple inputs here, so we can use these to modulate the clock speed. So let's start by doing that with an LFO. I'm going to take this LFO and I'm going to send a sine wave in to modulate the clock speed. You can see it's modulating the clock speed, but it's making it super fast, and that's kind of nuts. So what we want to do is scale that LFO with a VCA. So I'm going to go into this VCA before I go into this clock modulation, and we're going to bring that way down. And so now you can hear that when the LFO is at a higher voltage, the clock starts to move faster. In fact, let's use triangle wave. Slow that down a bit. So we can hear that change as the triangle wave gets to a higher voltage. The gates start to speed up. And as it comes down to a lower voltage, they slow back down. And we can change the range a little bit. If we do it with a sawtooth wave, it won't slow back down, it'll only speed up. Or with a square wave, it'll just alternate between a slow speed and a fast speed. Or we can get rid of this amplifier here. Or we could just use the square wave as its own clock. And we can send that into this external clock input here. And now the LFO is going to be controlling the speed of our sequencer. And it's going to be determining the speed of the gates. In addition, we can use the pulse width on the LFO to change the width of the gates. So right now they're even, like a square wave. We can change that pulse width and get narrower and narrower gates. Open it back up, get wider gates. We're just going to use the sequencer's regular internal clock. And now I'm going to replace this VCO here with the Bufaco even VCO, and you'll see why in just a second. So we're going to send our sawtooth output into our filter. And then we're going to send our volts per octave into the volts per octave here. And we'll switch to a lower octave, and let's see how that sounds. Okay, so now what we're going to do is you notice that the even VCO has 2 volts per octave inputs. So one of them we can use for the sequencer and the other one we can use for the keyboard. So we're going to grab one of these MIDI CV inputs. We're going to set it to listen to the computer keyboard. And then we're going to take the volts per octave input, or output, I should say, into the volts per octave input of this oscillator. And so now it's getting volts per octave information from the keyboard and from the sequencer. And these are just going to get added together. So whenever I press a new key on the keyboard, this whole sequence will be transposed so that the bass note, the root note of this sequence, will be the key that I've pressed on the keyboard. So you can't see me pressing the keyboard, but if you listen, you'll hear whenever I change the key on the keyboard, because you'll hear the entire sequence get transposed accordingly. I realize it might be a little easier to hear if we didn't have quite so many pitches. So instead of this quantizer, I'm going to switch to the VCV rack quantizer, which will let me select individual pitches. And we're going to send that to our thing here. And then instead of using all the pitches, we're just going to use a triad. So I'm going to use C, E, and G. And so now all the pitches that we hear are going to be in the major triad. So let's unmute that. And so now when I change pitches, it should be even more audible because we're just going to be switching to different major triads. So yeah, there you go. Doing this, we've changed the sequencer into kind of an arpeggiator, which is kind of handy. So we still have this bottom row that we haven't done anything with. So I'm going to copy this even VCO, and we're going to send this to control the pitches of this new oscillator. Actually, we should get another VCA and quantizer. Go ahead and send these over here. We'll take row 3 out into the VCA, then from the VCA into the quantizer, from the quantizer into our VCO here, and then we'll send that into our mixer. And right now we're just getting a drone because these are all at 0, but if we start to change our pitches, and this oscillator up here has a filter that it's moving through, so maybe we'll do something with this oscillator, but instead of a filter, let's use a wave shaper. So we're going to stop off at this wave shaper before we go to our mixer. And maybe we'll even take row 2, which here was changing the filter, and we'll use row 2 also to change the wave shape. And that's made this second oscillator a lot louder, so I'm going to turn that down in my mixer. And this tone up here had a ADSR, so let's give that to our second one. So we're going to pop into this VCA before we go to our mixer. And we're going to use the gate from the sequencer and send that to the gate of this ADSR. And we'll give this a different envelope. So we have these two voices now in counterpoint. Here's our first voice, which comes from row 1. And here's our second voice, which comes from row 3. All right, so now I'm going to clear everything out, and we'll look at a different sequencer to help us reinforce some of this stuff. Okay, so now I've pulled up the JW Module's grid sequencer. And this is a cool sequencer. It contains a 4x4 grid of different steps. And there are these arrows at the top, which are going to determine whether the sequencer moves from left to right, or from right to left, from top to bottom, or from bottom to top. And this sequencer has a lot of cool functions, but it doesn't have its own clock. So we're going to need some kind of external clock. We could use an LFO, but rather than doing that, let's grab an actual clock module, and JW has its own clock, which is kind of handy. So this clock module, at the top, it's got an on-off button. Then it's got this dial where we can actually set the BPM, and it shows you the BPM at the bottom, which is nice and handy. And then here's the output for our clock. So we're going to take that, and we're going to send that in. And there's not a simple gate input. We have to send it to one of these arrows here. So if we send it up there, we can see, I don't know how easy that is for you to see, but there are lights across the top row blinking that show us that we're moving from left to right. So let's go ahead and send the output here to our oscillator. And we're going to send the gate output to our ADSR. And right now we're getting all the same pitch because all these knobs are set to the same pitch. So rather than try to move them all and create something, I'm just going to hit down here on the bottom right. You'll see there are two random buttons. One that randomizes the gates and turns some of the gates on, some of the gates off, which you can do on your own manually by clicking these little gate on-off buttons. And we can hit a button that just randomizes all the notes. So let me do that. It's going to open our filter up so we can hear those. And let's go ahead and speed that up a little bit using our clock. And if you look, we don't have to run through a quantizer here because this sequencer has its own built-in quantizer. It actually looks a lot like the JW quantizer. We can set the root note. I'm going to set that to F again. And then we can set the scale. Let's go to the pentatonic scale. And so now every pitch that's outputted by the sequencer will be in the F pentatonic scale. And right now we're just moving across this top row, just this four-note sequence moving from left to right. And even though we're only sending the clock into this first input, we can hit these arrows, click on them to move to different rows. So if I click down, it's going to jump down to the second row, hit down again, jumps down to the third row. I can hit up to go back to the second row. And we can send the gate to just the down arrow and just move up and down instead of from left to right. Do the same thing, click around to different rows. We can go into this random input, and it's just going to choose a random step from all 16. It just randomly grabs one. Let's go a little faster. And this rep input stands for repeat, and it's just going to repeat the same cell over and over again, the same step. And we can still use these arrows to navigate. Let's go ahead and set that back to left. And we can also take our output and connect it to something else. So I'm going to connect that also to our filter. So in addition to these voltages going to control our pitch, they're also opening and closing our filter. And we can even do something else, like maybe we'll send that to our ADSR and it's going to change our attack time. So here, some of our pitches now have a longer attack time than others because our attack time is being modulated by these voltages. I'll go ahead and get rid of that. Now another cool thing about this clock module is it has this reset button. And what this will do is if you just hit this button, it's going to reset the clock. And if we send that into our sequencer here, it'll just reset our sequence, just like the reset button on the Seek 3 module. So right now we're moving across the second row. And if I hit this reset button, it's going to jump back to the beginning. I don't actually need this connected because there's a reset button on the grid. And it jumps back to the top left here. And every time I hit the reset, it jumps back to the top left. And if I connect this reset from the clock module, then whenever I hit the reset on the clock, it'll reset the grid sequencer. Now that itself is not very cool, but down here there's this random reset, and what this knob does, if it's all the way at 0, this reset button will never be struck on its own. But as I bring it up higher and higher, what I do is I make it more and more likely that the reset button will be struck randomly. So if it's up just a little bit, this random reset will happen very occasionally, not very often. And as I bring it up higher and higher, you can see by watching the blinking lights or just by listening to the sequence that it becomes more and more likely that it's going to reset. If I move it all the way to the right, it just resets nonstop. So we don't want that. Let's go ahead and have it where it's moderately likely. So now we have this cool little 4-step sequence that randomly resets every now and again. But let's say, what if we did something else? Rather than randomly resetting, why don't we have it randomly hit the down arrow? actually moving kind of quick. If you can see in here, you can see that it's jumping from row to row to row because this random is being struck pretty often. I'm going to make it less likely. You can kind of hear a little pattern start, and then every now and then this random reset is sent, strikes the down arrow, and it moves down to the next row of the sequencer. I could also send that to the random input, and so then every now and then it's going to play through a single row, and then every now and then it'll randomly jump to a random step in the sequencer. We could also use this random reset to, I don't know, randomly change the gates. So now it's not going to be jumping rows, it's going to always be moving through this same row, but the gates are going to randomly be turned on and off because this random trigger is going to trigger this random gates. Let's make it less likely. So it's still always moving through this third to last row, or the second to last row, but the gates are changing every time this reset randomizes the gates. We could also send it to randomize the notes or whatever we want to use. Let's see, I kind of liked it when we were randomly jumping to a random step, so let's go ahead and randomize our gates once more. And we're going to leave it here where it's just moving through a single row but then randomly jumping to another row. And let's go ahead and add some delay and reverb and make this sound a little more spacious. All right, so to wrap up, today we talked about sequencers. We went over just the basic definition and give an overview of a sequencer, talked a little bit about the history, how it started on the Buchla synthesizer invented by Don Buchla. We talked about Silver Apples of the Moon, that great piece by Morton Subotnick that kind of first demonstrated the capabilities of the sequencer. And then we went over some sequencer-specific terminology like clocks. And then we looked at sequencers in VCV Rack. We spent a good amount of time with the Seek 3 module, which is part of the fundamental collection. And then we looked at the JW Grid sequencer and the JW Clock module. Next time we'll get into some things like clock dividers, which you can see there at the bottom of that JW Clock module. So we'll talk about what these outputs do down there, and we'll also get into some other advanced functions with regard to sequencers. Have a good one.